Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking inside Islam, but maybe not in the way you typically expect. We're focusing on something less talked about, themes of, well, disillusionment and discontentment from within. We've got this fascinating stack of sources here, articles, bits of research, some really, really powerful personal stories. And they seriously challenge the common view, giving us a pretty surprising look under the surface. So our mission, as always, is to unpack this stuff together, pull out the key insights, and help you get informed fast. Let's get into it.
The picture a lot of us get from the outside, often from the news, right? It's that Islam is this solid, unshakable force. Like everyone's totally on board, ready to push for Sharia law. That's the Islamic legal system everywhere. That idea of it being monolithic, it's really out there.
It really is.
Yeah.
And what's so striking about the material we're looking at is how strongly it pushes back against that. Mm-hmm. These sources, they tell a very different story. They suggest that common pictures, well, it's just not complete, not really accurate. They're highlighting the feelings of disillusionment, discouragement. They're actually pretty widespread inside Islam. And these feelings often seem directly linked to specific teachings, cultural pressures, even, systemic things within the faith itself. One thing that really jumps out from the research here is just how much struggle there is internally. A surprisingly high number of Muslims, and get this, even Muslim leaders, report wrestling with deep spiritual needs, feeling this real lack of satisfaction or peace inside the system. Actually, the former Muslim leaders interviewed in these sources, they reported feeling more disillusioned than their followers, significantly more.
Whoa, hang on. More among the leaders. That's
right.
Yeah, that immediately makes you ask why. What are these sources saying is the root cause of this discontent?
Well, according to this material, a real central issue is the total lack of assurance. Assurance of paradise, for any Muslim. It doesn't seem to matter how devout you are, how perfectly you follow the rules, prayers, everything. There's just no guarantee you'll make it. The perspective laid out here is that, in the end, only Allah truly knows who gets into paradise. Even the most respected sheikhs, the scholars, the leaders, they aren't sure about themselves. They apparently tell followers, only Allah knows.
And it's interesting how the sources link that uncertainty to just daily practice. They mentioned the daily prayer, lead me in the right way. If you're saying that multiple times a day, asking to be led, it could sort of subtly make you wonder, well, am I already on the right way? This constant asking for guidance might actually trigger a deeper search for that certainty, for assurance that, yeah, this is the path to paradise.
Exactly. That concept of assurance, knowing you're on the right path, knowing your future, is secure. These sources pinpoint that as something fundamentally missing in the Islamic framework they describe.
Yeah.
And that missing piece, it seems to be a major source of that internal struggle for a lot of people.
To make this really concrete, the material dives into a specific, powerful story, the story of Sheikh Ali. What do the sources tell us about him?
Well, he's presented as coming from a pretty privileged background, influential family, lived this incredibly varied life. He was a student, businessman, politician, even spent time as a prisoner in exile, was a fighter, became a respected community leader. And crucially, through all that, he was deeply committed, became this influential teacher in a madrasa, a religious school, right, tied to a very strict form of Islam. And he had this real deep hunger to understand the Quran. Genuinely wanted to live by God's will. He was devoted, trying to convince others, became a sought-after teacher. But he realized something early on. A lot of Muslims don't actually know the Quran for themselves. They just sort of accept what the leaders tell them. And he noticed these leaders almost always shut down questions about the Quran. Why? Because those questions are often really hard to answer from within the system.
So despite this incredibly varied life, all this strict practice, praying 5 times a day, on time, the 17 rakats daily, those prayer cycles, Ali just found no deep satisfaction, no real inner peace. He even thought, maybe if I become more strict, that'll fix it.
But that intensive study, trying to be even stricter, it had the opposite effect, according to this account. Instead of peace, it actually started raising doubts about Islam itself, even though he was this respected, influential sheikh.
And the sources get specific about what bothered him. He felt the repetitive prayers. They just didn't feel like genuine, heartfelt prayer, But then his questions got more fundamental, like about the Quran itself, its origin, how it was put together. He knew the story. Revelations in a cave, not written down right away. Followers wrote bits down years later, and the official version, compiled by Caliph Uthman, that was like 40 years after Muhammad started having visions, maybe 20 years after he died. So Ali's question was basic but profound. How much could really be remembered perfectly after all that time from different people? How could you be 100% sure it was God's pure, unaltered word?
Right. And he also struggled with the Quran structure, found it difficult, kind of confusing, no clear timeline, hard for regular folks to grasp without tons of commentary. And this was critical for him. He felt the promises in the Quran seemed aimed almost entirely at Muhammad, which led him to ask, okay, but what about promises for me? Where's my assurance?
And it wasn't just the Quran. The sources talk about the hadiths, those collections of Muhammad's sayings and actions. And the point made in this material is that the hadiths often seem to contradict the Quran. They give this really disturbing example, a hadith saying, Allah created white people from Adam's right shoulder for paradise and black people from his left shoulder for hell.
Yeah, and Ali, being a black man himself, described how deeply that specific hadith troubled him. Understandably, he started questioning the whole point of his devotion, praying, fasting, building mosques, if this widely accepted teaching meant he was already destined for hell. He apparently asked many respected, wise sheikhs about it, but nobody could give him an answer that satisfied him.
So wrestling with these huge doubts about the core texts, the practices, his own destiny, where do you go from there? The sources say he found something significant while studying the Quran itself, specifically about Isa, who is Jesus.
Yes, exactly. This is where things took a real turn for him. He found passages, like one saying it's wrong and brings punishment to judge or distinguish between Allah and his messengers, like preferring one over another. That made him stop and think. Why were we always taught not to read Isa's sayings? Based on this passage, maybe reading about Isa should actually bring blessings, not get you in trouble. He also found teachings right there in the Quran saying that people who disbelieve in Isa will be punished here and in the hereafter, while believers get a great reward. And he noted how Islam's, Jesus the Messiah, is called the word of truth, and his followers are described as superior.
Wow. So how did finding these passages make Ali feel? What did he conclude? He says finding these things about Isa just made him incredibly happy. It felt like that was the assurance he'd been missing. Assurance about his future, about heaven. For the first time, he felt like he knew. The sources say right then, that same day, he started actively looking for followers of Isa to learn more.
Ali's story is so specific and powerful, right? But the sources stress this isn't just one isolated case. They point to several bigger issues that seem to contribute to this wider discontent. One major area is the whole understanding of God's nature in Islam compared to, say, the Bible. According to these sources, the Islamic system views God quite differently. The idea of a close, personal, loving relationship with God, that's not really presented as possible, or even the goal within the framework described here, calling God Father or Abba. Completely foreign concept.
And like we saw with Ali, the whole Sharia system, for all its rules, offers zero built-in assurance of paradise for anyone.
Right. Another huge point in the material is this perceived lack of freedom. Freedom for inquiry, for independent thought. The accounts suggest the system doesn't really encourage asking tough questions about Islam or the Quran. Often questions get brushed off or even forbidden by leaders, which ironically seems to just create more doubt for people trying to understand. Former leaders interviewed for these sources, they talked about feeling this immense sense of liberation, even joy, when they started reading the Bible and felt they were discovering truth about God.
And it's not just theology. The sources mention cultural and social things causing friction too, like the treatment of women. These former Muslims note that poor treatment of wives and children can be, sadly, almost a cultural norm in some places. There's also this feeling of cultural imperialism. Islam is so tied to Arab language and culture that non-Arab Muslims, who are the majority worldwide, can feel like second-class citizens in their own faith.
Yeah, and you see contradictions in practice, too. You have strict rules about food or alcohol, right? But the sources mention widespread addiction issues, things like khat, alcohol even among some leaders in certain communities. Generosity is another aspect. There's zakat, the duty to give 2.5% of your wealth. But some former Muslims felt the system didn't always foster a spirit of, joyful, compassionate giving beyond that bare minimum, especially compared to what they later saw among some Christians. And quickly back to the Quran itself, there's this paradox. Intense focus on its perfection, but most Muslims can't read the original Arabic and translations. Often discouraged, sometimes forbidden. The former leaders in this material, they believe this keeps most people from finding potential contradictions, or crucially, those passages about Isa al-Masih, Jesus.
Lastly, the sources bring up discomfort with violence and the internal splits. Peaceful Muslims interviewed expressed real worry about interpretations of Islam that seem to tolerate violence, that tolerance feels corrosive to them. And the constant, often violent divisions within Islam itself, that's deeply perplexing and distressing for many. The material even hints that maybe that profound lack of assurance could partly explain the appeal of violent jihad for some, like a desperate, misguided attempt to gain God's approval or find some certainty.
So with all this internal questioning, this discontent, where do searching Muslims turn? What do the sources suggest? Well, the perspective presented here is that maybe something bigger is happening. These sources suggest God himself might be at work within Islam, sort of preparing hearts, maybe cracking foundations a bit.
But the material is also realistic about why Christianity isn't always the first place they look. They see the issues in historically Christian countries, divorce rates, sexual ethics, pornography, greed, abortion things exported globally, and they're often, frankly, rightly offended. They judge the culture they see coming from the West.
That's a really important point. That what does draw them in, according to these accounts, it's usually not the big church buildings or the Western cultural packaging. What comes up again and again in a very high percentage of the former Muslims interviewed here are two main things. One, seeing the genuinely changed lives of other former Muslims who embrace Christ. That's huge. And two, personal experiences with Christians showing real generosity, kindness, just being friends, even while they were still Muslim. And maybe the most powerful pull, highlighted repeatedly, is answered prayer. They contrast traditional figures like marabouts, who might give out objects for protection, with Christians they meet who seem to actually know God personally. Christians who pray directly and see things happen, healing, deliverance. This practical evidence of a God who is alive, who listens, who acts. That's presented as the single biggest draw for many making that shift.
Yeah, and the sources share another story that hammers this home, the power of answered prayer. This second person grew up in Quran school. His father was a sheikh, but also a marabout involved in occult stuff. And this man, from a young age, really struggled. Attacks by evil spirits, constant sickness. He started questioning, why doesn't our God help us with this? He felt this deep lack of peace.
So according to his story in the sources, a friend at school told him about Jesus, about the life he offers. He even gave him a Bible. He hid it, of course, because the sheikhs always said the Bible was corrupted. Can't trust it. But then later, there was a really bad drought in his area. He got curious and went to a Christian open-air meeting nearby.
And get this, right in the middle of the sermon, this massive rain and windstorm just blows up out of nowhere, hits the whole area, and then a Christian woman, the pastor's wife, she stands up and prays with this incredible authority, not just for the storm to stop, but also for rain to come properly in the next few days.
He describes thinking, wait a minute, my God controls the rain and wind, that's what we believe. But this woman is commanding the rain in Jesus' name. So he made a pact with himself right there. He'd believe in Jesus if her prayer made the storm stop right around their shelter so the meeting could go on, and if the needed rain actually came later.
And unbelievably, his account says the storm did stop right around them. The sermon continued calmly, but you could see it's still storming like crazy, just a little ways off.
Wow, so that experience, understandably, kicked off his search. But he still wrestled, especially with that idea the Bible was corrupted, because the sheikhs kept hammering that point. He went back to the Quran, prepared 21 specific questions he had, took them to his class. The sheikhs teaching flat out refused to answer any of them.
So, really disappointed, still searching, he grabs his Bible, goes off alone to a mountain, and before reading, he prays this very direct, honest prayer. He asks God, help me understand this Bible. Show me if it's corrupted or true. Show me if the Quran is true. Speak to me somehow. Show me which book to follow. Then he went home, went to sleep.
And that night, he has this incredibly vivid dream. He dreams his father's land is split in two. One side is full of good, healthy wheat with a Bible lying in the field. The other side, messy weeds, useless crops with a Quran there. In the dream, a man tells him the weedy side is useless, takes him over to the wheat, feeds him from the harvest, and the man explains, this dream is the answer to your questions about the true book. And he also told him about Jesus' resurrection.
Amazing. He says the very next morning, no hesitation, he went out to a field, hands up, prayed to give his life to Jesus, asked for protection from his family, strength to follow. His Christian friend took him to church, and he just started diving into the Bible.
And just like Sheikh Ali, he points back to that initial catalyst.
Yeah.
It all started because he saw with his own eyes that the God of the Bible answers prayer.
So bringing this deep dive together, looking at all these sources, we've seen how that common view of Islam as this totally unified, satisfied block gets really challenged. We see this internal disillusionment coming from some deep places. That lack of assurance about paradise, big questions about the text, cultural pressures, lack of freedom to ask questions, and a fundamentally different view of God's nature compared to a relational one.
Exactly. And connecting this back for you, the listener, understanding these internal dynamics gives, I think, a much richer, more nuanced, and probably more accurate picture than just the external view we usually get. It really highlights this universal human thing, doesn't it? That longing for truth, for assurance, for peace, for a God who isn't just distant, but who cares, who interacts, who can actually be known.
Yeah, the depth of that search, the struggles we heard in those stories, backed up by the research, it's really something.
It absolutely is. And thinking about that profound search for assurance that these sources show is clearly happening within Islam, maybe it leaves us all with a question to ponder. What does it really mean for you to have confidence in what you believe about your own future? And if that kind of assurance matters, where would you genuinely look to find it?